So if you think about like the stories you tell at dinner parties,
Right.
right? The anecdotes about your childhood, or maybe the reasons you quit a job, or how a certain relationship ended.
Right. You usually just assume you're telling the truth.
Exactly. We all do. I mean, we kind of accept that human memory is a little hazy and maybe a bit romantic. It shifts subtly every time we recall a narrative to, protect our egos.
Oh, for sure. It's totally
Yeah,
natural.
yeah, but consider what would happen if you treated your own memory not as a personal truth, but as like a rigid engineering problem.
Mm.
Imagine refusing to trust your own mind unless you could prove every single claim with hard, verifiable evidence.
That sounds exhausting, honestly.
Right, but it's also brilliant. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a truly breathtaking, just cinematic new literary memoir called The Geography of a Life by David Ward. And, spoiler alert, you are going to want to pick this up tonight.
It is such an extraordinary approach to the memoir genre. It's this generous, uplifting, deeply moving exploration of a real life. The narrative basically traces this massive geographical journey, starting on the rocky coast of Cork in Ireland, winding all across Europe, and eventually ending up in the Swiss Alps.
Yeah, and it's not just a travelogue,
No,
right?
not at all. The premise is that this physical movement across borders acts as a catalyst. Every new city he lives in effectively installs a new principle into his mental operating system.
I love that framing. And today we're tracking a man who walked away from a very comfortable, inherited life to build a completely new one from the ground up. But before we trace that route, we really need to look at how this book was built.
Oh, the methodology is fascinating. It's central to understanding the whole thing.
Yeah, because David Ward spent nearly a decade working as a validation engineer at Eli Lilly, which, is a massive player in the highly regulated pharmaceutical industry.
And in pharma validation, I mean, the stakes are literal life and death. The core rule of that world is basically, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen.
Right.
A validation engineer rigorously tests processes to prove they do exactly what they claim to do. They look for any point of failure. And Ward took that exact rigid scientific standard and applied it to his own autobiography. The book calls it the evidence-first method.
Which is just wild to think about. So let's break down what that actually looks like.
Yeah.
The foundation of this entire book isn't some drafted manuscript in Word. It is a 57-minute, unedited oral history recording.
Yes.
And to make sure that this foundational record could never be, like, secretly altered or sanitized later to make himself look better, he checksummed the audio file. He ran it through an algorithm to generate a SHA-256 hash.
Which, for anyone unfamiliar with data security, an SHA-256 hash is essentially a unique cryptographic fingerprint.
Right, like an unbreakable seal.
Exactly. If you change even 1 second of that audio file, the fingerprint changes entirely. So by publishing that hash, the foundational record of his life is mathematically locked in time.
That is so intense.
It really is. And from that locked audio, the text expands outward, relying on, I think it's 451 meticulously reviewed photographs and 303 journey frames.
Yeah, and a journey frame, just for context, is a specific, verifiable spatial and temporal data point, kind of like a geographical anchor.
Like a specific GPS coordinate on a specific day.
Exactly. So every single memory written in this book has to be traceable back to primary evidence. If a memory couldn't be proven by a photo, a record, or a verified journey frame, it just wasn't allowed to be presented as fact.
And this rigorous standard leads to what he calls the honest editorial audit.
I found this part so refreshing.
Right. Most memoirs hide the drafting process. They give you this polished narrative that makes the author look, heroic or fashionably flawed. But this book actively points out where his human memory drifted and corrects it right there on the page.
Yeah, the specific examples of this memory drift are so revealing. Like, there's a photograph mentioned in the text that he initially thought was an image of his parents. But through this auditing process, verifying timelines and visual details, the text corrects this on the page. It's actually a photo of his uncle Ciaran.
Yeah, and a more emotionally complex example is the story about him playing football as a teenager at Calais Creostry.
Oh, this part got me.
His unaudited memory framed his leaving the sport as a personal failure. Like the narrative he carried for years was just, I couldn't keep up physically, so I quit. Which is such a common self-deprecating story we tell ourselves.
Totally. Think about how often you've done that in your own life, just softening a complex situation by taking the blame. I just wasn't good enough.
Exactly. But the evidence-first method, along with witness testimony, proved that narrative was totally historically inaccurate. The audit revealed that he had actually suffered an injury near the end of his playing time. And simultaneously, his closest friend and teammate, Brian, had been sidelined with a severe cruciate injury, and the team was facing relegation.
So it wasn't just about inadequacy at all?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
He didn't quit because he couldn't hack it. He left because, with his own injury and his teammate gone, the physical and emotional weight of the whole situation had shifted entirely onto him.
And the book specifically notes that his friend Brian never judged him for stepping away. The audited, truthful version is just so much more nuanced than the simplistic version he had convinced himself of.
It really is.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, though. It's like leaving the scaffolding on a beautiful building. It doesn't ruin the art. It proves the structure is real. Like that brilliant detail of the book's final hero image taken in Barcelona.
Oh, the tilted photo.
Yes. The horizon is completely off. But instead of digitally straightening it, they deliberately left it crooked with this amazing caption: "The picture is cryptid. The decision wasn't."
What's fascinating here is how much this method relies on witnesses. I mean, AI or software can assemble a timeline of your credit card swipes and GPS locations, sure, but data alone doesn't capture the reality of a life.
No, it's too sterile.
Right. The book notes that only his mother, Anna, could provide the necessary corrections to his childhood memories. A memory is really just floating possibilities until human witnesses anchor it to the truth.
That is beautifully put. And because the book is so incredibly honest about where it comes from, we really have to look at the deep roots he was walking away from. You can't understand the journey without understanding the gravity of his starting point in Cork.
Right, because the narrative doesn't start with him running away from a broken home. It actually starts with this gorgeous, deep examination of inheritance.
Yeah, we meet his grandparents, Betty and Joe, who built this substantial foundation. And the text describes this incredibly interconnected community spanning Kinsale and Cork City.
Yeah, it's an environment where the local sporting heroes aren't distant celebrities on TV. They are your actual neighbors, family, friends, people your dad works with.
And there's this vividly described visual evidence from the family archives, this beautifully restored photograph of a massive, multi-generational family gathering.
That photo is amazing.
Yeah.
The frame is just crowded with people squeezed onto couches, babies sitting in laps, everyone beaming at the camera. It's this tangible, breathing proof of a profoundly secure and loving community.
Which sets up this amazing paradox. He didn't leave because he hated this life. He was working at Eli Lilly, which is the exact same place his father worked, operating alongside family friends. But he suddenly realized he was living a life that was perfectly laid out for him.
And that realization leads to one of the best quotes in the book. I wasn't afraid of leaving. I was afraid of never leaving.
Wow.
It's a profound pivot because the comfort of an inherited life can be completely paralyzing. The moment you decide to stop living by those community expectations is the moment your personal map just goes blank. You have to draw it yourself.
And he starts trying to draw it, but history actually forces his hand. In early 2020, he plans this dream trip to Boston for St. Patrick's Day. He's meeting up with people he considered childhood heroes, aligning it with the anniversary of his university thesis, and then COVID hits.
The timeline just collapses. He gets a call from his travel agent saying, "You have 48 hours."
48 hours.
Can you imagine? The global system is shutting down. The validation engineer who models failure points suddenly encounters the ultimate unmodeled failure, and he's forced onto a flight back home.
And the resulting principle here is so sharp. The text says, history doesn't cancel your holiday, it interrupts your life.
Yeah, it forces him right back into that inherited structure of Cork, stewing in this realization that he desperately needs to forge his own path.
So I have a question about this. When the borders finally open and he leaves for mainland Europe, moving through Belgium, Amsterdam, and Spain, is he actually running towards something? Or is he just terrified of a life that looks complete but feels borrowed?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he really isn't fleeing his inheritance. The book explicitly addresses this. He says, an inheritance is not something you conclude, it is something you spend.
Oh, I love that.
Right. He leaves to figure out what that solid foundation was actually meant for. If you view a secure upbringing as fuel rather than a cage, you aren't escaping. You're taking the resources and the security your grandparents built, and you're going out to see what it can purchase.
Which takes us from the conceptual weight of his inheritance to the literal weight he carried on his back. Because spending that inheritance leads him to a period of intense disorientation in Rome.
Yeah, he's visiting 100 different churches by day, seeking quiet, and then by night he's immersing himself in the chaotic party scene of the San Lorenzo district.
It's like a physical manifestation of grief, right?
Yeah.
Swinging wildly between solemn reflection and total excess.
Exactly. And during this period, he walks into a confession booth in the Vatican. He says his Hail Marys, and the priest listening on the other side simply mentions that he himself has just returned from walking the Camino de Santiago.
Just a random connection in a confession booth. And Ward leaves the Vatican and immediately maps out a route for Spain. Which brings us to the most grueling physical challenge of the book.
The 995-kilometer journey on foot across northern Spain.
Just sheer scale, it's incredible. But the defining thematic moment happens almost immediately at kilometer 5.
Right. He begins the walk carrying this massive, heavy tent. And for those first 5 kilometers, the physical burden is heartbreakingly heavy. It's crushing him. So he makes this analytical decision. He takes off the pack, drops the tent, and abandons it.
He just leaves it.
Yeah. He commits to walking the remaining 990 kilometers carrying nothing but a hammock and a sleeping bag.
So what does this all actually mean? Well, think about the psychology behind a tent. It's shelter, right? It's a barrier between you and the elements. It's the illusion of absolute safety. And by dropping it, he perfectly encapsulates another principle of the book. The journey begins the moment you drop the weight.
Which raises an important question about what he was actually dropping. It wasn't just canvas and poles. He decided what he was trying to realize out there, and he dropped everything that wasn't it.
Wow.
And once he shed that illusion of safety, the walk became incredibly simple. Just reach the next marker, follow the shells, until the arrival in Santiago.
And the arrival in Santiago is wonderfully dismissed by the book as just one photograph, because the true journey was the 300 photos that came before it, the fog, the Vatican, abandoning the tent that was the journey. Santiago is just the receipt.
Exactly. So having walked 1,000 kilometers to shed his old self, he finally has the space to build a new one. The road ends, and the train to Sion in Switzerland begins.
Yes, the canton of Valais. He takes a job that requires a grueling 7-hour round-trip commute to Lucerne every single day.
Which is agonizing.
It is. Most people structure their whole lives to avoid that kind of commute.
But Switzerland wasn't just a residence for him. The book frames it as a laboratory. He deliberately chose one of Europe's most highly regulated, precise industrial environments to force his own transformation.
Putting himself in that rigid external structure to give boundaries to his chaotic internal reconstruction.
Precisely. The exactness of the trains, the regulated work, its external scaffolding.
But the deeply moving part is where he finally finds community. It's not in a boardroom. It's on the terraces of FC Sion.
The irony is just striking.
Right. The man who left every field and job when the weight shifted finally found a terrace he wouldn't leave.
Yeah, attending over 100 matches, standing in the cold, wearing a yellow shirt, smoking outside before kickoff with complete strangers. People who spoke a different language and owed him nothing, but they became his people.
It perfectly proves the book's thesis. Home is not something you inherit, it is something you build.
And speaking of languages, the way this book is published is a linguistic triumph in itself. It's not just a translation exercise.
Oh, this is a brilliant detail for anyone listening. The book is published as governed editions in English, French, and Spanish.
Meaning the author maintains strict control over the translation, so that the translated text operates under the exact same evidentiary rules as the English version.
It literally lives in the 3 languages it was lived in. But there's this beautiful refusal to translate the Irish names. They are left completely untouched in French and Spanish.
Yeah, leaving them as the unalterable source code of his identity.
It's just so powerful. This cinematic, breathtaking book really needs to be next on your reading list. It's an incredibly uplifting story of a man who proves that a highly structured, analytical mind can perfectly coexist with a deeply romantic, searching soul. It's just a gorgeous love letter to the people and places that shape us.
It absolutely is. It refuses to let history fade into blurry nostalgia.
So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a lingering question directly inspired by the book's evidence-first method. If you were to apply this honest audit to your own life right now, like if you were to pull the raw tape, the checksummed records, and the unedited photos of your past 10 years, would the evidence actually match the story you've been telling yourself?
Or would you discover that the most important chapters of your life are the ones you've been misremembering all along?
It's a wild thought. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Pick up the geography of a life and keep questioning the map of your own lives. We'll see you next time.